Now, in terms of carbon, before talking about it explicitly, I'll just share a bit of a background, how our experience that we've sort of backed into this almost accidentally, and then it's ended up becoming a big part of what we do. But we were focused really on on reforestation and working with farmers. In our earlier years, a decade ago, it was really hard for us to get funding for this kind of work. And then the carbon space really was starting to come into its own, we sort of fell backwards into it. And it was, but we were some of the earlier players in this space, and particularly working with smallholder farmers, and so quickly became sort of like leaders in this space, just because we backed into it so early. Um, and just over like my personal experience over the last 10 plus years in this space, there's it's definitely been a trend. It's really hard to imagine a future scenario. There are people like climate change, carbon, nah, it doesn't matter. Like the world's only gone more and more focused on that. And I think it's completely undeniable that the future is just going to get more and more affected by climate change, and more resources and thinking, and brain power is going to be dedicated to this cause. So to me, there's no doubt that is a huge part of it. Now, what shape and form is that going to take? um, that is always changing. That's been another constant over the last 10, 15 years. Sometimes people say carbon credits is the future, and sometimes people say no, carbon credits are horrible, what we need to do is taxation. And people, and that I think is a real like political, it changes around. But at the end of the day, if we focus on like what we're talking about now, and climate resilience and climate change for coffee farmers, um, what is true, as I mentioned in the beginning, is that coffee can be a natural climate solution, but it can also be a problem. And the the world seems increasingly willing to pay to put money into this. And from a producer perspective, there is no shortage of people saying, I would like to get rewarded for the environmental services I produce. Often smallholder farmers are the ones that are including the most trees in their agroforestry systems, and the more industrial production tends to remove all the trees to optimize productivity, because they're not thinking as much as resilience, because they're using chemical inputs and other things to do, and have access to more financial resources. So to me, money flowing into environmental services, and most notably carbon, is a constant. What's up for debate, or what will surely change, is what we call it, and the mechanism we use to do it. In the earlier years, and even now, actually, the whole world of buying a carbon credit, and companies paying for it, was a thing, and it is a thing, and I think it will continue being a thing. And increasingly, like, we work with coffee farmers generating carbon credits, and create meaningful sources of cash that they are now receiving, which is great. But a trend that I'm seeing in the industry a lot, in particular in the coffee sector, is people are saying, you know what, buying a carbon credit is great, right? But it's really like a second best solution. And increasingly, we're finding that the coffee industry and coffee companies are really saying, we want to make investments within our supply chain, right? We don't want to just sequester carbon or offset carbon any which way. We want to make improvements within our supply chain. And so that's changing the focus a little bit. So saying, look, we don't want an anonymous carbon credit. We want to see the impact. We want to do this. We want to do it within the areas that we're sourcing from. And then when the focus switches that way, there's a lot of changes, subtle changes, that have big implications that go along with that. So all of a sudden, like, to create a carbon credit, there's this crazy amount of certification going on, right? You need all of this stuff, and that really drives up costs to get it, because a carbon credit was designed to be traded like outside your supply chain from an anonymous actor. So we were like, okay, well, since I can't see a carbon credit, since I can't touch a carbon credit, since I never receive a carbon credit, since I never smell a carbon credit, how do I get that proof that it's there? And so the standard bodies come in, they say, we'll put the legitimacy on all this. And quantifying carbon itself is like really, really complicated. It's like it's this big, and for a lot of people, just like this big black box. And so when people start doing within this supply chain, they end up going into these smaller groups, like who they're sourcing from, these cooperatives. And usually, like, the cost benefit of getting a carbon credit to certified and all that just outweighs the value of the carbon that's being sequestered, because you end up putting all your money into consultants, certifications, data analysts, blah, 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 and then it just becomes ridiculous. So we're finding people saying, okay, well, there's got to be better ways that we can put money into creating impact in a way that makes this less expensive and are more willing to forgo certification, provided we can get trust and legitimacy. And so then again, in our experience, what we found is that for these things to be successful, the money needs to go to the ground, not to the consultants and the certification. And that's one of the areas where digitization has so much potential, both in terms of like demystifying and making the black box simple, right? Like ultimately, like it doesn't have to be crazy complicated to get a good idea of how much carbon are in trees. And technology can be used to facilitate and automate that process so that the skill set can be done automated, so that humans, the human part, the coffee producer can focus on the things that are relevant to them as opposed to trying to quantify all of this. And the other area where I see it has a lot of potential is technology is increasingly being used as a somewhat, not a complete substitute, but a partial substitute or enhancement of these independent audits and verifications. Because when we're getting data from independent sources, we can create more trust and legitimacy in what's being measured. And this, many ways, becomes a really empowering tool for producers, because all of a sudden they own their information and it's a value add that they're creating. And if they can create the information that the marketplace wants on their own, well, that creates great value. And technology can really do that, make that possible.